It starts with a sound most of us never really hear anymore. A thin, nervous stutter of dots and dashes cutting through static. Somewhere in the dark, in a cramped attic under a sloping roof in occupied Europe, a single lamp is burning. A man or a woman leans over a suitcase radio, headphones clamped tight, fingers on a brass key. It's 2:13 in the morning. Everyone else in the building thinks they're asleep. On one end of this invisible line, a resistance network is hanging on by its fingernails, begging for weapons, money, targets, anything that says they haven't been abandoned. On the other end, in a nondescript room in England, an operator is listening to the same tapping and wondering if these are still the same voices as last week, or a trap. In between them, for just a few seconds, the only thing that exists is a burst of radio waves and a man in a van, miles away, turning a dial and drawing a pencil line on a map, trying to find them. We remember the glamorous images, agents dropping from the sky with silenced pistols and forged identities, blowing up bridges and meeting in smoky cafes. Almost no one remembers the people whose heartbeat was measured in words per minute, the operators who knew that every extra sentence might be the one that let the enemy find their roof. And that's the knot at the center of this story. In the War of Shadows, the most important people in the room weren't holding guns. They were holding keys. If all you've ever seen is the cinematic version of Espionage, stay with this one, because once you see how much of the Second World War ran through these invisible lines, you won't be able to unsee how many of the crucial decisions started life as a string of dots and dashes tapped out by somebody whose name you've never heard. Before we get lost in the romance of secret codes, strip it back to something simple: time. A human courier on a bicycle or on foot takes days, sometimes weeks, to move a message from an occupied city to a neutral embassy, a border, a safe contact. They can be stopped, searched, arrested, shot. By the time they arrive, the troop movement has happened, the raid is over, the safe house is gone. A radio message, if it gets through, travels in seconds. A network in rural France can tell London about a planned rail convoy, and hours later, a briefing officer can be pointing at that same line on a map, planning an air raid that might actually hit something that matters. In a fast-moving war, that gap, days versus minutes, is the difference between "we found out" and "we found out too late." Across occupied Europe, the British Special Operations Executive and other services build clandestine circuits, small groups of agents and local resistance fighters equipped with compact sets, codebooks, and the most important instruction of all: talk quickly, move often. On the other side, German radio counterintelligence units, the Funkabwehr, are doing the opposite job, listening for any signal that doesn't fit, hunting it, burning it out. We're told in school that wars are decided by decisive battles: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. But how many of those decisions depended on a little grey box in a kitchen or a barn, and a burst of Morse tapped out by someone whose name never made it into the textbook? It's easy to praise the outcome. It's harder to look at the mechanism. So let's pin the camera to one night in one room. The operator we're following is a composite, but nothing about their situation is fictional. You could have found versions of them in France, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, the Balkans, anywhere the occupation had pushed people underground. The routine starts long before the set is switched on. The day is spent pretending to have a normal life: work, cues, carefully ordinary conversations. No one must ever suspect that the quiet young woman on the third floor or the polite clerk downstairs spends their nights transmitting enemy military secrets to London. On the table, a watch, a small notebook, a code sheet, a one-time pad. There's a schedule agreed with London, a sched, a fixed window where they're expected to call in. Outside of that, silence means survival. The rules are brutal in their simplicity: never transmit from the same place for too long, never stay on the air more than a few minutes, never fall into a comfortable pattern the enemy can learn. On paper, it's clean. In this room, it's not. The operator lays out the message text, groups of numbers and letters standing in for places, names, requests, a parachute drop site that needs changing, A list of collaborators, a warning about a planned raid. The watch ticks. They know from training that every second on air increases the risk that somewhere antennas are swinging towards them. Lines on an enemy map are converging. Someone is saying, "He's here, she's there, go." Imagine knowing that the more useful your message is, the more likely it is that trucks are already rolling towards your street. Do you send the bare minimum? Half the details, enough to justify the danger, but not enough to be really helpful? Or do you send the full picture your people in the field begged you to include, knowing that the extra minute might be the reason they get the guns, and the reason you never see daylight again? Headphones on, key in hand, they call their control station, call sign in the clear, then encrypt the traffic. Somewhere in England, another operator hears the call up and answers, and the two hands, one in a safe country, one in an occupied one, dance together over a gap of hundreds of miles linked by trust and static. Every slip matters. Send the wrong group and London might misunderstand the target or decide the whole message is compromised. Send for too long and it won't matter what's in the text. There won't be a circuit left to read it. While the key clacks, you can almost overlay other images on top of this room. A German DF officer, pencil between his teeth, notes the bearing of a new signal. He doesn't know who is sending, he doesn't care. He cares about angles, strength, repetition. On a different map, those lines will intersect and someone will be told to get in the truck. In England, a monitoring station logs the same traffic and hands the sheet to a cipher clerk. To them, it's another entry in another long shift, one voice in a chorus of signals. Only in this room does the sound feel like a heartbeat that might suddenly stop. The watch hits the cut-off time. The operator signs off, kills the set, starts unplugging and packing, listening for anything out of place on the street outside. The wrong engine, the wrong footsteps on the stair, the knock that doesn't sound like a neighbor. This is the paradox that will carry through the rest of the film. Speak, and you become a target. Stay silent, and you become useless. And the war in the shadows, the one that never makes it into the victory parades, was fought mostly by people trapped exactly on that line. If that imbalance bothers you, the fact that we celebrate the bridge blowers and barely mention the ones who made those operations possible, then good. That irritation is the point. Because in the next act, we stop treating radio as a backdrop and start pulling apart how this technology and the people who learned to bend it turned whispers into weapons. By the time our operator in the attic is keying that message, the war over the air has already been going on for decades. Long before anyone thought of secret agents, wires were being strung along railways and across oceans. The first telegraph lines in the 19th century turned electricity into language, dots and dashes travelling along copper instead of ink along paper. Governments learned quickly whoever controlled the lines controlled information. Then someone cut the wire. At the turn of the 20th century, experimenters like Marconi proved you could throw those same dots and dashes through the air. No poles, no cables, no physical route to guard. In the First World War, navies used wireless sets to talk to fleets. By the 1930s, radio was how dictators spoke to millions at once. By 1939, the technology is ready for something else, not just propaganda, but clandestine communication. Heavy ship sets become lighter field sets. Civilian radio parts get repurposed into something that can fit into a suitcase, a wine crate, an attic, toolbox. By the time the Second World War is in full swing, there are thousands of radios in Europe that officially don't exist. We tend to picture technology in this war as tanks, bombers, rockets, metal you can see, lined up in parades. But in half of occupied Europe, the most dangerous machine on the street weighs less than a crate of apples and can be hidden under the floorboards. You could walk past it every day on your way to work and never know that, once the lights go out, that same box is what makes airdrops, sabotage, and escape lines even possible. The basic trick is simple. Turn a pattern of current into a pattern of waves and hope the right ears are tuned in. The complications are everything. A clandestine set in 1943 is not a neat factory-made gadget from a catalogue. It's valves that can burn out. It's coils wound by hand. It's an aerial hidden as a washing line or strung inside a roof. It needs power, which means batteries you supposedly can't get, or tapping a house supply in a way that doesn't trip fuses at the wrong moment. Too little power and London never hears you. Too much and everyone does, including the people you're hiding from. Then there's the noise. Thunderstorms, other stations on the same frequency. Cheap components bending under heat. The waves that carry your message bounce off the ionosphere in unpredictable ways, skipping across countries. That's why a clandestine signal meant for England might be louder in Portugal than in London. Even if you do everything right at your end, there's no guarantee the path through the ether will behave. And yet, night after night, people keep flipping the switches. We like to tell ourselves that bravery is about charging machine guns or flying into flak. But there's a quieter, stranger courage in spending hours building a set you know may only be used a handful of times before someone kicks in your door, and building it anyway. Of course, the air isn't empty. For every clandestine signal trying to cross enemy territory, there are ears trying to catch it. The German Funkabwehr and similar units were created for exactly that, to listen for illegals, transmitters not listed, not authorized, not under Reich control. Direction finding is, in principle, a geometry exercise. You set up listening posts or mobile vans with rotating antennas. You hear a signal. You note the bearing, a line pointing roughly towards the source. Do that from multiple places at once, and the lines cross. Somewhere near that intersection is a building, a barn, a block where someone is sitting with headphones on. The more often a signal appears, and the longer it stays on air, the more precise your fix. That's why clandestine operators live under rules that sound almost superstitious, but are grounded in maths. Never transmit for longer than a few minutes from the same place. Never use more power than you need. Don't call up randomly, use pre-arranged schedules, and keep to them. From a desk in London, those sound like sensible safety procedures. On a kitchen table in Lyon or Rotterdam or Warsaw, they feel like a set of instructions written by people who will never have to listen for boots on their own stairs. You're told, never more than 20 minutes, then move. But what if the drop zone changed and they need to know? What if a liaison officer has been arrested and the entire network security depends on you warning London before dawn? What kills you first, the DF trucks or the guilt of what you didn't send? Zoom back to the van for a second. In the back, an operator logs call signs, signal strength, bearings. He doesn't know who is on the other end. To him, your life is a dot on a chart, an intersection to be circled and passed to someone else who will decide when to raid. And he's doing his job. You're doing yours. The difference is that when he switches his set off, he goes home. You don't. None of this works if the person at the key can't actually send. Training an operator isn't a weekend course. For the British SOE or the Free French, the pipeline starts with something simple and cruel. Can you learn Morse code fast enough, and can you send it cleanly under pressure? At a training school in the English countryside, recruits sit at benches with headphones on, listening to tapes or live senders. At first, the dots and dashes sound like a blur. Over weeks, the noise resolves into letters, then words, then sentences. Your brain rewires enough that you can hear at 20-25 words per minute and send just as fast without tripping over your own fingers. Speed matters because every extra second on air is a risk. Discipline matters more. You're taught to keep your fist, your individual sending style, as neutral and regular as possible. The enemy can sometimes identify individual operators by their rhythm, just like recognizing someone's handwriting. If you get sloppy, you become easier to track, even when you change locations. Then there's security. You learn codebooks, one-time pads, security checks. You're told never to reuse a piece of pad, never to send in the clear what can be encrypted, never to include names or addresses that might compromise anyone else. You drill what-if scenarios. What to burn first if you have 30 seconds, 10 seconds, no time at all. On paper, again, it's clean. In practice, humans are human. A tired operator reuses a phrase in multiple messages, giving enemy cryptanalysts a foothold. Someone in the field insists on including a real name just this once, because the person in London needs to be sure who we're talking about. A set is used too often from the same safe house because there simply isn't another location available. Every tiny breach is another thread for the enemy to pull. The tragic part is that in many compromised networks you can go back through the traffic and see the moment things started to go wrong. Longer transmissions, repeated errors, obvious breaches of training. You can almost taste the exhaustion and desperation bleeding through the Morse. From London's point of view, reading that traffic months later, the verdict is simple. They broke the rules, they endangered the whole circuit. From a cramped flat in occupied territory where neighbours gossip, landladies ask questions and soldiers knock on doors at random, those rules can feel like a luxury written by people who will never have to choose between sending a compromise message or sending nothing at all. If you've ever had someone judge your decisions from a safe distance, you already understand more about these operators than you might think. Because the story of unsung radio operators isn't just about technology or codes, it's about what happens when systems that demand perfection meet human beings living in conditions where perfection is impossible, and how, somehow, enough of them still managed to get the signals through. In the next act, we stop talking in generalities and go inside specific lives, the operators whose fingers actually hit the keys, and what it cost them when the invisible war finally reached their door. By now, the room with the radio isn't just full of equipment, it's full of secrets, and every time an operator sits down at the set, they're not simply pressing a key. They're taking raw information, what someone saw at a bridge, which factory is suddenly surrounded by guards, how many aircraft are on a runway, and turning it into something that can cross borders without getting everyone killed. To do that, they need more than fast fingers. They need encryption. For most of us, code and cipher blur together. For them, the distinction could mean life or death. A code might turn ammunition dump into a 5-digit group, or attack at dawn into an innocent phrase about the weather. A cipher takes every letter of a message and scrambles it according to a system, shifting, swapping, mangling the text until it looks like nonsense to anyone without the key. In occupied Europe, many clandestine operators work with one-time pads, sheets of random numbers used once and then destroyed. There is no pattern to crack. If the pad stays secret and the rules are followed, even the best code breakers on Earth can't read what you're sending. That's the theory. In practice, the operator in the attic often does the encoding and decoding themselves. They have to check the groups, keep track of which lines of pad have been used, and resist the temptation to make it easier when someone in the field begs them to cut corners. It's easy to picture them as the person pressing the key. In reality, many of them are the last human filter between dangerous, specific information and a codebook that, if mishandled, will get entire networks arrested, tortured, or shot. So when they sit there, pencil in hand, turning words into numbers, they're not just acting as a modem, they're deciding what is too risky to send, what must be sent despite the risk, and how to do it without giving the enemy a free gift if they ever get hold of the traffic. Secure but slow, or fast but sloppy. In a war where hours matter, that trade-off never really goes away. And remember, the enemy is listening too. While an SOE operator in France is encrypting, German Funkabwehr stations and mobile vans are sweeping the bands for any sign of illegal transmitters. They're mapping call signs, noting schedules, learning to distinguish clandestine fists from authorized military ones. On the other side, British and Allied WWII stations are doing something eerily similar, listening to German, Italian, Japanese traffic, sucking in hundreds of thousands of Morse groups that will end up on the tables at Bletchley Park and other centres. There is a horrible symmetry in this. On every side, there's a lonely operator in a room with headphones on. On every side, there's someone trying to catch them. When a German operator pinpoints a clandestine set in France, what does he tell himself? I'm just doing my job. This is enemy activity. It has to be stopped. How different is that really from the Allied analyst in England, flagging an Axis call that he knows will end in someone else's train being blown up, someone else's ship going down, someone else's son not coming home. We're not saying the regimes are equivalent. They're not. But if you want to understand the psychological world these radio wars created, you have to look at the common layer. Technical people trained to turn other people's lives into signal strengths, bearings, and decrypts. Distance makes it easier to file human beings under traffic. Sometimes distance collapses. Take one circuit in occupied France. It could be any of several. The pattern repeats across the continent. For months, a small network has been feeding London with regular reports, troop movements, depot locations, names of collaborators. The operator, let's call her Marie, because there were many Maries, works from a series of safe houses sending on fixed schedules. At first, everything goes by the book. Short transmissions, frequent moves, strict discipline with codes. Then the tempo of war changes, more drops are planned, more sabotage is requested. The demands from London grow urgent. We need more detail, we need confirmation, we need you on air longer. Marie is exhausted, the local group is under strain. People have been arrested in neighbouring towns. She has fewer secure places to work from, but the messages are important. Weapons are coming, operations are being coordinated with Allied plans they can't fully see. The traffic increases. From a German listening station, operators start to notice that this particular signal pops up more often from roughly the same region at roughly the same times. Bearings are taken. DF vans roll. On the ground, security starts to fray. Maybe a codebook is left in the same hiding place too long. Maybe an agent, under pressure, insists on including a real name just this once. Maybe Marie, dead on her feet, makes a repeated error in her cipher groups that gives enemy analysts a way to link several messages together. None of these mistakes alone is fatal. Together they form a map. The Funkabwehr crews tighten their net. Each time Marie transmits, their fix gets a little better. They note when the signal appears after curfew, which quarter of the city it seems strongest in, which nights she doesn't transmit at all. Back in London, the only thing anyone sees is that the messages are coming more frequently, with more information. From that distance, it looks like success. Then one night, the Germans move. Several vans take up positions around a neighbourhood where the bearings converge. As soon as the familiar call sign hits the air, operators swing their antennas, shouting courses to the driver. The vans inch closer. Upstairs, in a shuttered apartment, Marie has no idea that the few minutes she thought she still had have shrunk to seconds. Maybe she keeps to her time limit and just slips away in time. Maybe she pushes a little longer, trying to fit in one last crucial detail about a planned derailment or a new headquarters location. Maybe the first she knows of the fix is when boots hammer on the stairwell and someone shouts for the door to be opened in the name of the authorities. In some real cases, operators were arrested at their sets, headphones still around their necks. In others, they escaped by minutes or less, leaving warm valves and half-sent messages behind. From a historical distance, we tend to focus on what those last transmissions achieved. If the messages Marie sent in those final weeks led to weapons arriving on time, to sabotage that cut rail lines during an invasion, to ambushes that saved Allied soldiers' lives, we file it under worth the risk. But stand in that room with her for a moment. She might have been ordered to keep transmitting even after security warnings were raised because HQ decided the intelligence was too valuable to lose. She might have argued. She might have been overruled. She might have felt the dread tightening each night she tuned the set and laid her hands on the key anyway. If the intelligence extracted from those final messages saved dozens of lives or turned a failed operation into a success, does it change how we judge the people who ordered her to stay on air? Does it change how we judge her if she knowingly stayed a little too long? There aren't easy answers here. There are just layers. The technical, the tactical, and the human, sitting on top of each other like pages in a file. Keep watching, because in the next act, we stop looking at maps and intercept logs and face the people themselves, the operators whose names were missing from most of those files, and what it cost them to keep the air alive. By now, the radio war has a shape in your head, signals, bearings, maps with pins. Act 4 is where that map grows a face. In training photographs, a lot of the wireless operators look barely older than students. Young women in SOE or the FANY smiling stiffly in uniform before being sent into occupied France. Local resistance members in civilian clothes learning to work a set in a barn. Operators in exile sitting in long rows in English country houses, WRNS and other staff glued to headphones 12, 16 hours a day, writing down every fragment they hear. They're highly trained, they've passed Morse tests, security drills, language checks, and they're told, often in brutally plain language, if you're caught in the field, you will likely be tortured and executed. Headquarters can't protect you. At best, they might not even know you've disappeared until the traffic stops. On paper, it's just another role specification. In reality, it's a quiet death sentence, stapled to your job description. When we imagine heroic resistance, we picture guns, sabotage, rail tracks blowing sky high. It's not as easy to picture heroism as someone sitting still, night after night, in a cramped flat, knowing that their battlefield is 3 meters of wire, a suitcase set, and the knowledge that their most likely reward is a shallow grave rather than a medal. Ask yourself honestly, if you were 23 and someone told you you're going to be vital but disposable, would you still sign? The human cost doesn't announce itself with explosions. It shows up as isolation. An operator in the field often works alone or with one trusted helper. The fewer people who know where the set is, the safer the network, on paper. In practice, that means long hours in attics and cellars, waiting for the sked time, listening to the clock and the sounds on the staircase, wondering which one will reach you first. You can't talk about what you do, not to neighbors, not to strangers, often not even to family. Every extra person who knows your real role is another potential leak under torture, another risk that a drunken remark in the wrong cafe puts a DF van on the road. So you live a double life. Normal by day, invisible node by night. You develop an ear for danger, the particular way boots sound on cobblestones when they're moving as a squad, the silence in a stairwell that means someone is listening, the slight change in your own heartbeat when the set warms up, and you know that somewhere out there, another operator you will never meet is already turning an antenna in your direction. Over time, that vigilance doesn't switch off. After the war, many survivors describe symptoms we'd now call PTSD, insomnia, jumpiness, panic at sudden noises, a lingering dread whenever a phone rings or someone knocks too hard on a door. Some have permanent hearing damage from long hours with headphones, others carry a different kind of tinnitus, made of memories they can't quieten. And here's the uncomfortable part. Very few of them were treated like veterans. There were some decorations, some mentions in dispatches, but a lot of operators slipped back into civilian life with no parades, no public stories, no long speeches about their sacrifice. Many didn't even tell their families the full truth for decades, if ever. We're good at honoring people who charge machine guns. We're not so good at honoring the ones who sat in a dark room for months, slowly coming apart, because someone kept sending the same message down the line. We still need your traffic. If that double standard grates on you, it should. Because the way we value people like this in hindsight says a lot about who we're prepared to value right now. Then there are the ones who never got the chance to grow old enough to be forgotten. By 1943, some Allied planners talked about the life expectancy of a clandestine wireless operator in occupied territory in terms of months, sometimes weeks. It wasn't said to scare them. It was said as if you were discussing the operating life of a machine. From a headquarters point of view, an operator is a node in a system. You have to know roughly how long that node will survive so you can plan training, replacements, new circuits. You write memos about expected loss rates. You warn people. You do what you can. But on the ground, that abstraction means something very simple. When you sit down at the set, you know you are working your way through a statistical curve that usually ends in a cell, a camp, or a courtyard wall. In some cases, London or other HQs suspected that a station had been compromised, captured operators forced to send under enemy control, yet continued to use it, carefully, as a channel for controlled information to mislead the enemy. To the people making those decisions, it was a harsh but useful game. Feed deception through a poisoned pipe. To the human beings at the other end, if they were still alive, it meant being turned into bait. In occupied countries, arrests of radio operators were often followed by brutal interrogations and deportations. Many were executed in camps or prisons, shot or gassed or hanged in places whose names only appear as lines in post-war trial documents. Families received nothing, or a curt notification that a relative had died of natural causes in detention. Try just for a moment to hold both perspectives in your head. From headquarters, an operator is a vital but replaceable asset in a system designed to defeat an enemy. Losing them is tragic, but sometimes acceptable if the intelligence gained saves more lives elsewhere. From their family's point of view, they were a daughter, a son, a lover, a friend, not a node, not a line on a chart, someone who liked a particular song, laughed at bad jokes, left shoes in the wrong place by the door. When those two views collide, whose definition of acceptable loss wins? We often tell ourselves that the sacrifice was worth it because the right side won. Act 4 forces a harder question. Worth it? For whom? If you're feeling uneasy about how easily people like this slip into footnotes, that's the point, because the way we remember them or fail to shapes who we choose to listen to now when different kinds of operators and truth carriers are once again being told quietly that they are essential and expendable. If you care about the people history buried, not just the ones it put on posters, stay with this story to the end. In the end, it always comes back to a simple, sharp question. All this risk, all these nights at the key. What did their signals actually change? Across occupied Europe, a lot of parachutes only opened because a radio operator got the coordinates through in time. Those crackling bursts of Morse guided airdrops to fields and forest clearings where resistance groups waited in the dark for weapons, explosives, money, and instructions. One missent group could scatter a canister into the wrong valley. One clean transmission could arm a whole region. Other messages were warnings, a rushed transmission, more patrols on the main road, a new unit in town, rumors of a raid. Sometimes those scraps of information gave people just enough time to move a meeting, hide a leader, send a family into the woods for the night, instead of letting them sleep in a house that would be surrounded by dawn. Higher up the chain, radio traffic built the picture that staff officers and intelligence chiefs used to decide which bridge to bomb, which convoy to hit, which resistance operation to back, and which to veto as too risky. Not every message saved lives. Some preceded operations that failed catastrophically. Some were sent under duress from already compromised sets. Some never got through at all, lost in static, atmospherics, or errors made by exhausted fingers at 3 in the morning. But without that flow, without operators willing to sit down and press those keys, the resistance would have been working blind, and headquarters would have been deaf. We love the big cinematic moments, the sabotage raid, the derailed train, the firefight at a factory gate. But the things that made those moments possible often sounded like this. Morse beeps in your head for a second, and were keyed in by someone whose name never made it onto the film poster. So who do we remember? We write biographies of the charismatic agents, the organizers, the saboteurs. We cast actors to play them, dress them in period costumes, give them speeches and close-ups. The wireless operator usually appears as an extra in the corner, a flash of headphones, a hand on a key, a single line of dialogue. Then the camera moves on. That habit didn't end with the Second World War. Today, a lot of the most dangerous information in the world passes through hands you'll never hear about. Analysts, sysadmins, SIGINT techs, the people who build and run the systems others rely on. Investigative journalists who sift through leaked files, whistleblowers who decide to push evidence into the light knowing that the people they embarrass have more power, money, and lawyers than they will ever see. Different technology. Different acronyms. Same basic position. Close enough to see the damage clearly, far enough from the spotlight that if things go wrong, they usually fall alone. Looking back, it's easy to say, of course they were heroes. Pile up the documents, look at the outcomes, and the judgment feels obvious. The harder question is aimed straight at you. Right now, when someone quietly handles the dangerous information in your world, the report that exposes abuse, the data that shows fraud, the testimony that contradicts a convenient story, do you treat them like a hero or a nuisance? Do you instinctively move to protect them? Or do you roll your eyes, question their motives, decide it's not the right time, and let them twist? If a name just popped into your head, hold on to it. Drop one name in the comments, past or present, of someone who carried the truth in a way that cost them more than it ever paid. A radio operator, a codebreaker, a whistleblower, a journalist, a colleague. Put them in the record here, because that, in the end, is what this whole film has been about. Who gets written into the record, and who gets left humming quietly in the background until even the echo fades. Let's pull the thread all the way back through. We started in a dark room with a single set warming up, and the knowledge that somewhere, unseen, someone was already hunting for that signal. We watched how a century's worth of technology turned wires into waves and waves into weapons. We saw how codes, ciphers, and direction finding turned radio into a constant cat-and-mouse game where every burst of intelligence was also a flare saying, "I am here. Come and find me." We put names and faces to the role, young women and men given a job description that quietly included torture and execution as likely outcomes, told that their value would be measured in traffic, not in years of life. We stayed with the unease of knowing that on paper they were nodes in a system. And on the ground, they were just people trying to survive long enough to make the next sked. The war in the shadows wasn't just fought by agents leaping out of aircraft with forged passports and pistols. It was held together by people bent over radios, sending and receiving bursts of dots and dashes that could change operations, save networks, or get them killed in minutes. They were essential, they were treated as disposable, and for a very long time they were mostly forgotten. If you care more about the people history buried in the footnotes than the ones it put on posters, subscribe. This channel exists to drag the real architecture of war and espionage into the light, starting with the hands on the key, not just the finger on the trigger. If you think these operators shouldn't stay invisible, push this video a little further out of the algorithm's basement. One like, one share. That's how stories outrun the silence that swallowed them the first time. And don't just watch. Use the comments to write names, radio operators, codebreakers, whistleblowers, anyone whose work stayed invisible while others took the credit. This is where we start fixing the record, because somewhere, in a box, in an archive, or in a memory that hasn't quite dimmed yet, there's still a faint echo of that sound. Morse, one last time. Someone saying, across decades, "I was here. I did my part. The least we can do now is answer."